In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential targets such as military bases and chemical plants may be advised to evacuate.
Hello, Sublation Media viewers and readers. It's I, Douglas Lane, returned for another week of the Sublation Magazine show. With me today is Matt McManus. He is the author of The Political Theory of Liberal Socialism, as well as many other books. He's written for Unheard and Jacobin and just about any publication you can think of. Matt has written for them. And Sublation Magazine, of course. And I'm glad to have him back. He was an author I published at Zero Books, and I'm glad to talk to him again about his latest book. So, Matt, welcome to the Sublation Magazine show.
Yeah, it's good to talk to you again. You're looking well. By the way, apologies. I have a bit of a cold today, so if I seem a little bit zonked out, that's the reason, but I'll do my best to make everything clear.
Okay, and I have a toothache. You have a cold. We're both sickly individuals, but we'll soldier on. So you have this new book. When did the book, The Political Theory of Liberal Socialism, come out?
It's actually coming out this Friday, so November 22nd. It's about like $30 on Kindle, I think. So apologies for that. I know it's not the cheapest thing in the world. I'd recommend that you wait until Routledge has a sale, and you might be able to get it for like $25 or something.
Is it in paperback already, or is it hardback?
It's in paperback and hardback. So like a lot of academic books, you can get it in kind of multiple different formats. If you wanted the version that's my favorite, I'd recommend getting it in paperback, since there's a kind of cool cover that I worked a fair bit on. It has a nice red rose and all that kind of stuff. The hardback is kind of a really, really, really boring blue cover. I wouldn't recommend it, just for aesthetic reasons.
Okay. But it will last longer, maybe. I don't know. There's actually debate about that. But okay, enough about the technical details about the publication of your book. Let's jump into it. When I was reading your book, I noticed that you began by stating that this was a controversial book, that many people who call themselves socialists don't like to think of themselves as liberals, and to claim liberalism for socialism was somehow controversial. Why do you think that is?
Well, I just think that because the minute I announced that I was writing a book on the subject on Twitter, just a horde of really, really, really angry people like fell on me, actually from across the political spectrum, interestingly enough. You know, you had all kinds of neolibs who had Milton Friedman in their profile picture, Hayek, quotes somewhere or another, being like, absolutely not, how dare you, you're profaning our sacred tradition. And then there were quite a few very, very kind of radical left types, Maoists, Trotskyists, Marxist Leninists, who also said, absolutely not. This is profaning our tradition. And look, what I point out in the book is that my understanding of liberalism and socialism are both ecumenical. So there are forms of socialism that would obviously be incompatible with liberalism, and there are forms of liberalism that would obviously be incompatible with socialism. What I'm talking about is a form of liberal socialism that integrates the two together, I think at a theoretical level, quite successfully in some cases, although there are problems with the tradition that we can get into.
Yeah, well, I'm interested in the definitions and the way you separate things out. I have come to accept that my first kind of instinctual political orientation is liberal. Mm-hmm. That I'm not, that the Marxism that I embrace developed out of my understanding of the economic crisis of 2008. And I still, align myself with the Marxist tradition, of course, consider myself to be a Marxist. But, I was an anarchist before that. And I think that anarchism was really an offshoot or a development of basically a liberal orientation.
Sure.
But what do you mean when you talk about liberalism and maybe the like classical liberalism or the bourgeois tradition of liberalism? What is that, and then how is that different from what you define as liberal socialism?
Yeah, absolutely. So I follow people like Alan Ryan and Michael Frieden and a lot of others in pointing out that liberalism is an extremely diverse tradition. It looks a little different everywhere that it's been instantiated, and it looks a little bit different every time it's been instantiated. So there are forms of liberalism, as I mentioned, that are resolutely hostile to any kind of democratization of the economy. The main example that I give in the book is what C.B. Macpherson called the tradition of possessive individualism. And the tradition of possessive individualism, according to Macpherson and myself, really gets going with people like Hobbes, Locke, and many of the other classical liberals. And it essentially holds that the proper way to understand society is as a collection of asocial individuals who are competing with one another to try to satisfy their hedonic drives. And the way that they do that is through market competition, right? Ideally. And in order for this to function properly, we need very strict protection for property rights, but not protection for things like a worker's ownership of his or her own labor. That's not something that we need to protect, precisely because all the classical political theorists understood that workers need to be able to alienate their labor for an employer in order to produce, to use Marxist terms, something like surplus value. So that tradition of liberalism is obviously irreconcilable with liberal socialism. And I point out that it has a lot of permutations and a lot of influence. You can see that amongst right libertarians today, people who identify as classical liberals, and of course, neoliberals like Milton Friedman, Hayek, right? They would have no truck with any kind of socialism, even if they might be willing to contemplate a very minimal welfare state in some circumstances. But I point out in the book that there's another tradition or other traditions of liberalism that are much more open to the idea of learning from the socialist tradition or even identifying liberalism with socialism. So we don't need to get into a huge amount of detail about this because I'm sure we'll talk about it a lot more. But in my book, I point to Thomas Paine, the great revolutionary, as really the originator of this kind of discourse. Now, there are a few different reasons for this, but one of the reasons I point out is that Paine was one of the first major revolutionary liberals to insist that property was not a natural, but very much a social institution. And secondly, arguing that the rich, by virtue of owning a lot of property, particularly in land, had essentially expropriated the poor or prevented the poor from accessing the value that was in the land. And in order to offset this, the rich owed the poor an enormous debt that had to be paid through a wide array of different redistributive programs. Now, obviously, this isn't socialism, right? Paine did not live long enough to see that label even come into the lexicon. But this intimation that property is a social institution and can be tinkered with to benefit the poor, that's kind of where I start to see a lot of these instincts to move liberalism in a left direction coming from.
So I think I had a bit of confusion about this distinction between classical liberalism and socialist liberalism, because, or liberal socialism, because we recently read Rousseau as a part of the Sublation magazine, I don't know, quasi informal curriculum. We, after the main stream, some patrons jump onto a second stream and we kind of talk about either what happened in the primary stream or just what's on our mind or something we read, and we reread The Social Contract that Rousseau wrote, and my understanding of Rousseau and Locke or Adam Smith, all of these people, I would consider them to be kind of classical liberals. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that you just said, I think, and that you wrote in your book, was that the classical liberal position is one where people are thought of as being antisocial or asocial, atomized individuals. But I think in Smith and in Rousseau and in Locke, the social nature, the social character of the individual is understood, maybe in a dialectical way, like that individuals are even to achieve an atomized individual, there has to have been social changes. You have to have created a certain kind of society. So I wonder if that classical liberal position is really more contemporary liberal tradition rather than classical in the sense of being like the first or the bourgeois from the 18th and 19th centuries.
Yeah, that's absolutely an argument that you can make. And I should add, there are some liberal thinkers who try to reconstruct the tradition on exactly those lines. Two that come to mind immediately are Helena Rosenblatt and her quite interesting book, The Lost History of Liberalism, and then Elizabeth Anderson and her book Hijacked, who defends Locke against some of the criticisms that are made in exactly the vein that you do, right? So Rosenblatt's thesis is that the idea of classical liberalism, right, a minimal state, but extensive protections for private property, accompanied by imperialism, bluntly. She argues that that really only was invented as an idea in the 19th century, really the late 19th century, precisely to try to counteract the growing appeal of things like socialism, or at least social democracy, amongst many elements of British, French, and German liberalism. Think about people like John Stuart Mill, for example. Now, with regard to some of those thinkers, I would actually argue that they are problematically aligned with a kind of classical liberal disposition, right? Rousseau is the one that I'm thinking of immediately, precisely because he's such a mercurial thinker, and he's been interpreted and claimed by such a wide array of different traditions, right? For instance, Carl Schmitt, the Nazi crown jurist for a little while, used to appeal to Rousseau precisely to say, look, the general will doesn't necessarily have to be embodied in representative democratic institutions. It can just as easily be embodied in the will of a dictator who has no kind of restrictions on his power. Indeed, Schmitt said this might even be a better way of understanding this Rousseauian impulse, because if you have representative institutions that are then checked and balanced by other kind of government institutions, then the will of the people isn't being executed as quickly and as efficiently as one would like. So I don't want to get into a huge amount of detail about all the controversies around Rousseau. I just want to say that I think he's a fascinating thinker and he's very worth looking at. And I almost wanted to include him in the book, but then I ran out of time because as an editor, very often you're compelled to tell your authors, you get this much space and no more, because otherwise your book is going to be too damn expensive and no one's going to read it. So be disciplined. And I did my best to be disciplined on that.
Bear with me for a moment on Rousseau, because we just read him, and I know you are a scholar on the liberal tradition, so even if you didn't put him in your book, you probably have some understanding. One of the difficulties that we had as a group when we were reading Rousseau was trying to fully take up and understand his concept of the general will.
Sure.
How do you think that a Rousseauian notion of the general will has value for liberal socialists?
I think that it has value in the sense that, understood in a Republican way, the general will basically offers a way of conceptualizing a society characterized by non-domination, right? Where people are socially free to be authors of the laws that govern them. And many people who've drawn on Rousseau understand it in exactly that way, including many, for instance, of the French revolutionaries, right? And their successors in the 1848 revolutions, and many of their socialist successors for that matter, right? But there is, of course, a more demagogic or authoritarian interpretation of the general will. This is the kind of Schmitt point, which holds that the general will is not the aggregate of individual wills, but almost something that's akin to the real interest of, let's call it, the national Volk, right? And understood in this way, it's very clear how you could appeal to the idea of the general will in order to justify violating certain people's individual rights in the name of national solidarity, democratic homogeneity, all the kind of bad stuff that Schmitt advocates for in books like Constitutional Theory and other texts, right? So I think that Rousseau is, again, a fascinating thinker, and the left would be a lot poorer without him. But part of what makes his work so fascinating is precisely that it's so generative, right? That people take bits and pieces of his ideas and turn them in a lot of different directions. So from a liberal socialist standpoint, Rousseau that is committed to Republican non-domination and this idea of authorship of the laws that govern you, including in the economy, would obviously be very much in line with what we're talking about. The Schmittian idea of the general will entailing the national Volk getting its way, obviously that'd be completely incompatible with liberal socialism.
Right. Well, okay, I will, get back onto the main highway of this conversation and talk about the things in your book.
Yeah, I'm always happy to talk about Rousseau.
Yeah. Well, maybe we will some more. But I want to get to the section where you define liberal socialism. And I'll just say that it strikes me that your definition of liberal socialism does rely on a statist conception of society. And
Mhm.
so I guess I want to talk about that a little bit because the cleave between classical liberalism, which emphasizes the individual and individual freedom, and a more collectivist approach to socialism seems to be reproduced in your book. I feel like you run the risk of uh, being an advocate for something like a nanny state um, in your book. Um, but but how do you define liberal socialism? There are three core principles of it. Is that right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So I just want to make one thing clear, right? So, and this is actually what we were talking about before we got on the show. My book is intended as a retrieval of the political theory of liberal socialism, not necessarily a defense. And one of the things that I point out in the conclusion of my book is that liberal socialism failed in many ways to instantiate itself in a meaningful way, precisely because it didn't take into account extremely important points about, say, capitalism as a global system that involves enormous amounts of kind of cosmopolitan impetuses. So to your critique, I would say that that's absolutely true. And in my own defense of liberal socialism, it would need to be much more cosmopolitan, to invoke the title of one of my earlier books, in order to be successful. So let's just table that for a section. In terms of what I argue all the major liberal socialist thinkers are committed to, as you mentioned, I say there are three core principles. The first is a commitment to methodological collectivism and normative individualism. And what that means is that liberal socialists understand that human beings are, to invoke Aristotle or Marx, social animals, right? We can only flourish adequately in the right social environment and in cooperation with others, ideally, right? But they're normative individualists in the sense that they argue that it's the actually existent individuals flourishing that is what matters from a moral point of view. And the reason, of course, to adopt this perspective is precisely to guard against suggesting that reified social entities have a certain kind of normative status that we need to take seriously. Think again about the Volk or the civilization or the church community abstracted away from the needs of its actual members, right? All that's the kind of thing that liberal socialists would dismiss. So the second main principle that I argue liberal socialists are committed to is a developmental rather than acquisitive ethic. And what I mean by this is many classical liberals like Hobbes or Jeremy Bentham, or proto-classical liberals, I should say, in Hobbes' case, argued that for the most part, life is a struggle for power after power and for the gratification of desire through the exercise of one's power, right? That I'll be happier if I have more stuff rather than less. And the more stuff I have, the more utility functionings I'll end up getting, right? Now, all liberal socialists would say there's nothing necessarily wrong with stuff, right? They're not Stoics or Buddhist monks or something, but they argue that what is much more gratifying to human beings is the development or cultivation of what's sometimes called our capacities or our human powers. This is a point, for instance, that John Stuart Mill makes, even in the opening to On Liberty, where he invokes Humboldt and says we should be rather like living trees that are allowed to grow and develop ourselves to their natural extent. And this is a point that liberal socialists actually share with Marx. All right. So as many people know, in Capital Volume 3, Marx does that rare thing of talking a little bit about what a communist society would look like, where he talks about the realm of freedom versus the realm of necessity. And he points out how under capitalism, the development of human powers is purely done for the purposes of capital efficiency. Right. So to use the kind of Smithian example, capital will very, very, very much spend a lot of money and a lot of time to try to make someone good at making pinheads if they work in a pin factory. Why? Because it's profitable to do so. But it's not going to invest that much time in developing that person's other powers, because it doesn't need that person to have a lot of other powers. They just need them to be really good at making pinheads, right? Whereas Marx says, under communism or socialism, the development of human powers will be an end in and of itself for the first time, right? So that's a point where liberal socialists and Marxists normatively agree about what a good society should look like in a very deep way. And then the last principle I argue liberal socialists are committed to, and this relates back to the problem you mentioned about having a kind of statist understanding of things, is that liberal socialists are committed to the idea that we should try to achieve economic democracy within the context of liberal parliamentary institutions, understanding, of course, that certain kinds of liberal rights will need extraordinary protection, but that does not include rights to things like private ownership of the means of production. So all liberal socialists accept the need for personal property, and I think most socialists would agree with them at this point, right? Nobody wants a world where your apartment belongs to everybody and they can just walk in whenever they want, right? But what Rawls sometimes calls the commanding heights of the economy, or what Marxists would call the modes of production or the means of production, all of that is intended to be socialized or democratized. Although exactly how to go about doing that, liberal socialists disagree a great deal on that point.
Right. So I think that as a former anarchist, this acceptance that there's a need for violence in society, a need for a body of armed men specialized in, and trained to implement violence and to control the masses, and to go to war. That the necessity for that is something that, perhaps I'm being utopian, that I wouldn't want to incorporate into my socialism. I would want my socialism to be a bit more utopian than that. The other question I would have about this is, again, I guess it goes back to this division between the individual and the collective, because it seems to me to be reproducing the real terms of our society now, the historical terms, where the individual is privatized or atomized or separated from politics, and then there's this collective power that is instituted in the state for the collective, not of the collective, really. And so I wonder if you can be a liberal socialist and or not have the even the Republican state as the ultimate horizon of your politics.
Well, I'd certainly be intrigued to see somebody try to make that argument. And I should add, I've seen a few people who are identify as libertarian socialists reach out to me asking if they can read my book, because they're kind of interested in seeing whether you can enact such a radicalization. And I'm like to think I'm open-minded enough to say, sure, if you can demonstrate to me how my argument leans in that direction, and I'm convinced, then sure, I'll sign off on it, right? But in terms of why liberal socialists argue there needs to be something like a state, or at least a basic structure, as Rawls would call it, that that's largely for the reasons that are spelled out in Christine Sipnowicz's really good book, The Concept of Socialist Law, which is a kind of friendly critique of certain kinds of Marxist utopianism, particularly anarchist Marxist utopianism. So what Sipnowicz points out in her book is there's long been this kind of view among some Marxist circles that the ideal should be the state withering away, right? As the terminology once went, right? That after, the revolutionary period, there'll be a brief interregnum where there'll be a strong dictatorship of the proletariat or a republican democracy, whatever you want to call it. And then the whole purpose of this will be to enact the dissolution of the state and a transition to full communism. Why? Well, there are two main reasons that Sipnowicz points out. One, all socialists and Marxists tend to see the state as a tool of class oppression. And so the transcendence of a class society through communism would mean that the functional need for the state largely disappears. But the second argument is the one that's more germane for me, which was this expectation that with a transition to communism, our economic production would just become so hyper efficient that there'd be no longer any kind of need to ask questions about, say, distributive justice any longer, because each person would just be able to take from the social surplus more or less whatever it is that they wanted, right? Think about, some versions of Star Trek, right, where we all have replicators and we can just create wherever we wish any second. And what Sipnowicz points out, and what Rawls, for that matter, also points out, is on this second point, it seems extremely unlikely that we are ever going to transition to a society where there is absolute abundance, right? We're always going to be faced with conditions of relative scarcity, where choices have to be made about the allocation of resources. In fact, if you take environmental projections seriously, we might be heading towards a society defined by more scarcity than many of us grew up in, which is quite a frightening thought, right? And what this means is we're going to still need to collectively resolve questions about how to allocate resources, whether we're going to invest more in healthcare versus roads versus education, etc. And so I think to solve these problems, something like a highly democratic Republican state will be necessary. But I would add, and this is what all liberal socialists point out, that not only should this be highly democratic and participatory at the state level, certainly far more than we have right now, but these impulses should be extended into the economy, which is what makes it socialist, right? Because it should be workers that manage their firms democratically with a robust collection of liberal rights in the workplace to protect them even against their fellows. And that would be the ideal that we should strive towards. Although, just to kind of echo again, if you are a libertarian, socialist, or communist, or an anarchist listening to this and you think that some of what I said would be better serviced by a transition to a stateless society, by all means, send me what you're working on, and I'm happy to take a look at it.
Oh, great. So Spencer Leonard is the classic backseat driver when I do interviews, and he says it's not just a question of statism and anti-statism, but really it's a question of how one understands capitalism. And I think I understand what he's pointing at here, and you know, I could go into my old approach to talking to people who are what I consider to be socialists to my right, socialists still, but a little bit to my right, and say, oh, what about, you know, the commodity form, and what about the contradictions built into capitalism as a social form? But I think maybe rather than launch my prefabricated objections which may not even touch upon what you're aiming to say, I'm just going to ask you this: how does your understanding of capitalism inform your liberal socialism, and what is your approach to incorporating capitalism as a mode of productive life and as an historical form into your understanding of liberal socialism?
Yeah, that's great. So my understanding of capitalism is very much inspired by, of all people, Ludwig von Mises, who's kind of the villain of my book in many ways, right? And Ludwig von Mises says there are a lot of different features to capitalism, obviously, right? But when you boil it all down, it comes down to one thing, which is private ownership of the means of production, right? Or capitalist ownership of the means of production. Now, there are problems with this definition, even from the standpoint of trying to offer apologias for capital, but we'll just roll with that, right? And I would argue that liberal socialism, by not only contemplating but insisting upon the removal of the capitalist class would transcend the limitations of capitalism, although exactly how to go about doing that, again, liberal socialists disagree quite profoundly. Just to give two examples, right? So John Stuart Mill, in his later work, particularly later editions of Principles of Political Economy, used to say things like, look, capitalists don't really do all that much in firms. They provide a little bit of technical know-how, but nothing that workers can't supply for themselves, probably better. And for the most part, what they induce in the workplace is a kind of servile relationship. That is exactly the kind of thing, from Mills's perspective, liberals should be extremely critical of, because he points out quite rightly, liberals were ferociously contemptuous of aristocratic forms of social and political organization, saying there's something demeaning about having to abase yourself in front of a lord or to abase yourself in front of a king. But Mill points out, many liberals, and he's quite willing to chastise the contemporary here, saw no problem with workers having to do the same in the workplace, right? To abase themselves in front of the owner, or to abase themselves in front of the manager, etc. So he proposes a society that's defined by workplace cooperatives, worker-run firms. Now, there would still be markets on Mills's understanding, because these firms would compete with one another. And there are certain Marxist objections that you can make to this, arguing that this doesn't sufficiently challenge relations of production, even though it does change certain important features of how the forces of production are organized. But I would argue that this would be a big step forward, particularly if you accompany this with other reforms Mill thought were important, like the mass redistribution of wealth to avoid concentrations of political power through things like various ameliorative programs aimed at the poor. Rawls has a different conception of what liberal socialism would look like. He's also quite attracted to this idea of workplace democracy, right? The idea of democratizing workplaces. But he says, this should be accompanied by a relative parity in political power, both at the state level and in the workplace, which will mean taking more seriously this idea of instantiating a system of basic rights that would apply across society. And people like Elizabeth Anderson have also taken up this idea and kind of rolled with it in interesting ways. So from my perspective, if you have a society that gets rid of capitalists and moves towards a more democratic economy that is highly egalitarian. That is obviously a form of socialism. Now, if you're going to insist that socialism inevitably entails the elimination of markets, right, bartering and trading systems, then you might argue that liberal socialism isn't sufficiently socialist, right? But I would contend that it doesn't really seem realistic to me, A, to get rid of markets, and there are many, many different socialist traditions that have insisted that actually markets are entirely compatible with socialism as long as they are non-exploitive and as long as everybody receives their share, and that workers are the ones who are running firms. So that'd be my position on that.
So, what is it about? Because we started this conversation by noting that your liberal socialism was very controversial, which is kind of funny to me in a way, because it seems
Right.
to me to be, if I were to try to put together two words to define the socialism of the last, let's say, 15 years, the socialism of the Bernie Sanders movement, the socialism that actually tried to take power, I think I might say liberal progressive socialism. I put in that progressive, but liberal socialism is good enough. And so I'm wondering, like, what was appealing about liberalism to you? What value was the value that drew you to it? And was it an egalitarian moral principle that you were trying to embrace, or some other value that you thought liberalism encapsulated and could promote?
Well, there are kind of three reasons I felt it was necessary to bring these two together. And I want to say I agree with you, right? That, I'm a millennial and we're getting on in years, right? But, I still remember the Bernie Sanders campaign back in 2016 and in 2020 and how excited I was by all that. So inevitably, that stamped my kind of outlook on some things. But there are three main reasons I thought it was necessary to kind of conceptually bring these things together. One was, as you know, I spend an awful lot of time reading right-wing authors. In fact, that's probably my day job, really. And one of the things that you find the more profound thinkers on the right insisting upon is that there is this deep genetic and ethical symmetry between liberalism and socialism. This is a point that Nietzsche and Heidegger make routinely. Heidegger most expressly in things like Introduction to Metaphysics, where he kind of contemptuously says that capitalism, liberalism, and socialism, they're all metaphysically the same. And the point is that they're both Enlightenment humanist doctrines that are committed to kind of efficiently organizing the economy and society to procure the highest possible flourishing for individual human beings. Now, Heidegger, of course, was deeply contemptuous of this for a variety of reasons that we don't need to get into. But I think if you read these authors like I do, you do come away with a certain sense that they're at least partially right, that there are affinities there that make liberalism and socialism much more proximate to one another on the political spectrum than either tradition is with, say, the political right. Although, there's ways of marrying with right-wing thought, too. The second thing that really inspired me on this point was actually kind of gesturing to what you're talking about, right? Whenever I would talk to leftists in any space, I would sometimes ask them, like, do you really think that you want to get rid of freedom of speech? Do you really think that we should have less religious toleration? Do you want to get rid of freedom of assembly? Do you think that, we can do without the right to vote? All these things that are associated with liberal democracy. And if anything, 90% of them were like, no, in fact, we can't trust those rights in the hands of neo-libs. They'll sell them away for a buck whenever it is that they can. And for that matter, they might very well be right about that, right? But part of the point of my book was to try to make a lot of these convictions a lot more explicit, precisely by saying, look, there's nothing wrong with being a socialist and buying into a lot of these liberal values. And for that matter, there's nothing wrong with being a liberal and thinking that we should extend liberal rights and democracy into the economy. And then I suppose the third reason I was inspired to write the book was precisely the fact that illiberal forces seem to be on the march all around the globe. Particularly, post 2 weeks ago. Now, don't get me wrong. I think that there were very serious problems with real existent neoliberal societies, right? I agree with Samuel Moyn entirely that one of the reasons liberal democracy is failing everywhere is that it kind of sold itself out to neoliberalism, became radically uninspiring and plutocratic, and in many ways deserves a lot of the criticisms and the contempt with which it's held right now. But I don't think that means that we should throw away what even Marx considered to be the great historical accomplishment of liberal democracy, certainly compared to reactionary forms of political organization. And I wanted to at least provide some incentive for liberals and socialists to start dialoguing with one another through my book or anything else that people write, precisely because I do think that we need to be in the business of uniting against these revanchist and reactionary forces. What we need to organize around afterwards, maybe we can pigeonhole that debate, but the alarm bells are ringing, and we all need every man on deck in order to fight what's going to come.
Your third core idea in your definition of liberal socialism has to do with creating conditions for human flourishing. The thing that you just mentioned that Heidegger opposed, apparently. But the again, not to repeat myself too much, but again, the question is, I think, who is going to be empowered, or what kind of institution is going to be empowered to create those conditions, and can we rely on even a liberal Republican state to fully manage relationships within society so that every human being has the full potential to flourish and that their rights, both positive and negative, are protected? And I'll just add, Otto von Bismarck created old age social insurance, a national health system, poverty schools, all in the name of creating better conditions for people so that they could flourish within this Bismarckian state, right? So, I guess that's my objection here is that when we are aiming at creating conditions for human flourishing, we do, I think, need to ask, who has the authority to enforce and create those conditions?
Yeah, it's a great question. And this kind of points to the limits of political theory in terms of answering those questions, right? I do have an answer, by the way, so I'm not going to cop out on this, right? But
okay.
I think that we also need to be sufficiently rigorous materialists to recognize that ideal theoretic arguments for the normative ideal are nor substitute for a granular analysis of power and context, right? And in fact, I'm very critical of many liberal socialists precisely for ignoring the importance of material analyses of power for reasons that we can get in to before we finish. But look, I actually do not think that reforms merely at the state level, even in a country as powerful and as influential as the United States, will ultimately be sufficient. And that's precisely because many liberal socialists underestimated the extent to which capitalism is a global systematic totality, and it will invariably respond to any effort to even try to construct something like liberal socialism or any kind of socialism in one state, right? And so if I were to kind of project a useful horizon for what liberal socialist theorists could be doing in the future, it's precisely how to contemplate, how to think through not necessarily the international, but the global, right, in more systemic ways. And Doug, I've done a little bit on this myself when I wrote that How to Guide to Cosmopolitan Socialism book at your suggestion, which I'm happy I did because it sold pretty well and people seem to like it. But what I propose in that book is that the neoliberals are actually an example we can learn from, which might seem paradoxical. But what the neoliberals understood in the 1940s is that in order to make the world safe for capital, particularly safe for capital in an era where large democratic majorities wanted social democratic or socialist reform, international institutions were going to be required precisely in order to discipline states that got out of line, whether through things like structural adjustment programs or the simple implementation of American imperialism in countries like Chile, right? And if we were to win power in a sufficiently large-scale country like the United States, it would be incumbent upon us to try to construct international institutions that emulated the same kind of imperatives, but of course that were organized in order to make the world safe for liberal socialism or for socialist societies rather than for capital, right? And I don't want to get too speculative about that because boy, oh boy, are we a long way away from that. So it basically be science fiction, right? But I think that could be accomplished in a medium term period of time, right? The neoliberals were immensely successful in constructing a large number of international bodies and regulations, and for that matter, norms, all within a period of about 30 or 40 years. Now, it'd be much more difficult if we were to do that because the neoliberals had the advantage of essentially limitless resources and, of course, the willing interest of capital in order to do so, right? But I think that would absolutely be necessary in the future if we were to make the world safe for something like liberal socialism.
Well, listen, we only have a little bit of time left because you have to run, I guess, in about 5 to 10 minutes.
Gotta go to work.
Yeah.
The
so
tyranny of necessity imposes itself upon me too, right?
Yeah, right. But we just had this big election. I guess it was 2 weeks ago now. Time flies when you're having fun. And I wanted to just ask you how you interpreted or how you're understanding the election of Trump. What do you think?
Yeah, that's a good question. So look, like everyone else across the political spectrum, right? My immediate instinct was to say, "Oh, I'm vindicated," right? And if only the Democratic Party had done what I said that they should have done, then everything would have been different, right? I don't actually think that that's true, though. I think that if you look around worldwide, it's very clear that incumbent governments across the board, regardless of their ideological predilections, have failed in the face of inflationary pressures. That's true in the United Kingdom. It's going to be true in Canada in a couple of months. It was true in the United States, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? Interestingly enough, the one country that seems to be inoculated against this was Mexico, right? Which might have some lessons that leftists can learn since, of course, AMLO pretty seamlessly basically transferred power to his successor. So it seems like left populism might be immune to at least some of these kind of global processes. But look, if there was one lesson that I think I gleaned from the election that's favorable to liberal socialism, just to kind of partisanly advocate for my own cause here, it seems very obvious that the American people were deeply concerned with bread and butter economic issues. And if you look down ballot at a lot of the things that they voted for beyond just the president, things like minimum wage increases, for example, it seems like a form of left economic populism centered around challenging plutocracy could be very, very popular and also make partisan inroads into what's right now, at least the Trump base, right? I am very skeptical, and I'm sure that you are too, that the Democratic Party will choose to learn that lesson from this election and decide to pivot to a more left populist electoral agenda in 2028 or even 2026. Now, saying that, I've been surprised before. The world remains the same until all of a sudden things change. And if you had told me even 4 years ago that a New York Times columnist like David Brooks, who's about as neolib as it gets, would write a column like, Bernie Sanders was right. Or Andrew Yang would be saying things like, we really need to kind of recover a populist energy for the Democratic Party. I would have told you, that you're fucking drunk or you're high. And, by all means, right? But, let's have a serious discussion later on, right? So I think that to invoke a kind of Gramscian sentiment, my attitude right now is one of pessimism of the intellect, but optimism of the will. I think there are openings for us to kind of push for a left populist agenda in the United States, whether through the Democratic Party or for other vehicles. And I'd like to see people agitate for that over the next 4 years, because I do think that it could offset an enormous amount of the appeal of Trump as a kind of anti-system, but still system candidate. But whether that's going to end up happening, I mean, who knows, right? I don't have a crystal ball, and I've never been very good at gambling, so I will not make predictions.
Well, yeah, I was going to say that I've noticed a lot of people are pointing to Bernie Sanders and the Democratic Socialist movement as a left populist movement, and I think that has been the way it was understood by its opponents for a while, like the entire thing about the alt left.
Oh yeah,
that came up. People.
There's a term I haven't heard in a long time.
Yeah, it included people like Cornel West as part of the alt left. Anyone who was critical, basically, of the Obama years and the Democratic Party as it stood was considered alt left, which was a way of saying that these were left populists. When you take the term populist to be derogatory. But when you think about the populist term as being one which is kind of opposed to not like a deregulatory force in the old neoliberal sense, but one that is wanting to oppose the bureaucracy and the permanent institutions within our government that are unelected, that wants to empower the people more directly, and that's willing to demagogue its way into authority in order to do so. In other words, the turn against a kind of instrumental rationality in the state. I'm not quite sure that the Democratic Socialists really represented that kind of populism, given that they were all advocates for some sort of return to the New Deal, which was a moment where the power of the permanent bureaucracy was, reestablished and deepened. So I'm a little skeptical of the very notion of left populism as it's understood. I think it was born out of sort of taking, it's like if you're called queer enough times, you take it on as a badge of honor. Maybe the left populist label is something similar, but do you disagree with that, or what do you think? Are we left populists?
I agree and I disagree, right? I should add another thing that gave me some reason for inspiration is I was at Detroit DSA meeting on Saturday, and apparently the organization has gained 5,000 members in the last 2 weeks, right? And it saw growth last year too. So, that's a reason, if not for an overabundance of optimism, at least to kind of say, well, there's a small silver lining to all these things. But look, I think that let's just take Sanders as an example, right? I don't think that he's going to run in 2028 because the guy's going to be fucking ancient at that point, right? But he's a good kind of microcosm of what I'm talking about. In 2016 and 2020, there is no doubt that Sanders was widely perceived to be a genuine threat to the system, right? The entire Democratic Party essentially coalesced in opposition to him, or at least the Democratic elites, I should say. And what we got instead was Hillary Clinton, who lost to Trump in 2016, and Joe Biden, who did win 7 million votes, right? There's no doubt that he was initially quite popular, but that was essentially under ideal conditions where the country was falling apart. And even then, he only eked out a pretty narrow electoral win. By about, 42,000, 43,000 votes in a couple of states. So it's not exactly like Bidenism was overwhelmingly popular. Now, one consequence of this, to your point, is that Bernie and the kind of energies that he seems to have embodied were really reincorporated into the Democratic Party and to a large extent mainstreamed. And I think he himself seems to be aware of that, because the day after the election, despite the fact that he was campaigning for Kamala Harris, had nice things to say about Kamala Harris, he just released that blistering manifesto that sounded a lot like something he would have produced in 2016, talking about how the Democratic Party is out of touch, how they didn't confront the billionaire class, how we need to end Citizens United, all that kind of stuff. Now, I think that what we need is a lot more of this former and now latter day Bernie Sanders, or something that's a lot like it, because I think that if you are going to make a successful left politics tractable in the United States, absolutely, you need to have solid social programs, unimpeachable left credentials, and a vision for an optimistic future that inspires in people a sense of hope. But you also have to name names and say that the reason why it is that we can't have that right now is plutocratic rule or oligarchic rule, whatever it is that you want to call it. And until we actually challenge the power of entrenched plutocracy and oligarchy, they are always going to possess immense capacities to ameliorate or water down even the most sincere and passionate commitment to progressive reform, let alone radical progressive reform. So I think that what we need is a combination of a vision for the future that is genuinely inspiring and a sense of agonistic or antagonistic naming names, right? People need to know what the problem is, and they need to know what we need to confront in order to solve the problem.
What I noticed about this last election is that the billionaires played a major role in both parties, and more so on the side of Kamala Harris than on the side of Trump. There was one billionaire that got a lot of attention, Elon Musk, who was on the side of Trump, but there was a slew whose names I guess Soros might have been
Mark Cuban
one.
was the big one.
Yeah. Who's backed Kamala, And ultimately, the money didn't decide who won this election. Kamala had like $1 billion for her campaign. Trump had less than half of that, and yet he ended up winning the election. And one other thing that the Elon Musk story illustrates is that that it actually is relatively rare for the billionaire class to disobey the state, to break away from the ideology and programs that the progressive capitalist state is implementing. Musk bit the hand that was feeding him when he bought Twitter and released the information about state control of the media. And that doesn't make him a great hero of the working class, but it does. But we shouldn't get the wrong idea about where the billionaires have been aligned for the last 10 years. Like the especially tech sector has been very much aligned with the Democratic Party's progressive agenda, which included attempts to control what they called cognitive infrastructure. So when I see this election, I see it as some segment of the voters were voting against the deep state, which they saw as aligned with big capital. Would you disagree with that narrative about this election?
No, I think there's a lot of truth to that, and I think that you can see that in exit polls, right? Now, there's going to be a lot of mincing of the data that comes from this election for years, and it's important not to extrapolate too much from exit polls since they're notoriously unreliable. But in terms of the kind of groups that Kamala Harris did well with, one of them was actually people who earn less than $30,000 a year. So she seems to have won the very poorest segment of American society. Although some people have pointed out that also probably includes a lot of students, right, who were probably going to vote for her anyway. But it also includes, minimum wage employees, people working, one or two very dead-end jobs, the kind of people who would benefit from the kind of social insurance that Vivek Ramaswamy and Elon are claiming they're going to cut. But pretty much every demographic upwards from $30,000 to about $100,000 in terms of family income voted for Trump. And at least part of the reason seems to be, again, that they felt that the Democrats were not delivering on bread and butter issues, and also that they were a culturally elite party that was deeply removed from the concerns of ordinary people. Now, this is going to pose, I think, a tricky dilemma for progressive and socialist politicians going forward, because it seems pretty clear that the electorate, by and large, seems to be with us on economic issues, but not necessarily with us on a lot of cultural issues. And I can think that one of the temptations that's going to emerge is going to be to do what Sohrab Ahmari says many leftists should do, right? Adopt left populism with social conservatism. Now, I do not think that is the right way forward for normative reasons. I think that would mean abandoning concern with women's equality, racial equality, trans equality, et cetera, et cetera. But we need to find a better way to package a commitment to economic equality with a concern for these other kinds of equality. And I think this is where my Marxism comes in, stressing how overcoming the forms of inequities that emerge in a class-ridden society and how that's going to benefit everyone, women, racialized minorities, etc., could be the way going forward, precisely because there's a solidaristic dimension to this, right? But I don't have any firm answers to that because, I'm not a political operator. I'm a political theorist and a constitutional theorist. So I leave it to the people who are far more knowledgeable about these things to kind of work out rhetorically what the right step for that would be.
Yeah, I'm not in the business of advising the Democrats either. I'm going to plug your book again, which it's called The Political Theory of Liberal Socialism. It's out on Friday. And then, opportunistically, I'm going to tell everyone to look in Compact Magazine tomorrow because I have a piece that's coming out describing how Biden, the most pro-labor president since FDR, lost the working class vote, and when explaining how and why that happened. Listen, everyone should join everyone watching this, and everyone who's not watching this, everyone on Earth and in galaxies far removed should join us in the Parrot Room. Hopefully Spencer Leonard will be there because he was in the chat here. If he's still around, I'd be glad for him to join up in the Parrot Room. We'll have a conversation about this topic and many other things in the Parrot Room. But for now, we'll see you next week. And again, Matt, thanks for coming on the show.
No problem. Thanks for having me. Left is best.
Yeah.
In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout,